Well, good day everyone. David Wilson here. Hello to everybody at Zach's place. Once again, we're meeting together virtually because we can't do it any other way at the moment. We've been looking at the book of Nehemiah, and we come now to the last few chapters, chapters 11 through 13. And there's a lot of names listed in those chapters, and a few major points coming out of the three chapters. And so we're going to do them as a bit of a package today. If you want to stop the video and read the highlights of those passages, you might want to skip down all the names in the chapters, but read the rest of it and then get back to me and I'll be waiting for you. So Nehemiah chapters 11 to 13. We've been looking at the book of Nehemiah over the last few weeks and seeing that the exiles who were exiled for 70 years to Babylon and surrounding areas, that they've been allowed to move back to Jerusalem and to start rebuilding the city, rebuilding the walls, the gates, rebuilding the temple, as we read in Ezra, and rebuilding society as a whole. And we come now to the end of the book, where through much opposition, the walls have been built. What God had appointed has been fulfilled. It's just fantastic. So we come to a time of celebration, and we notice in these chapters, chapters 11 to 13, that first of all Jerusalem is repopulated through what I call a population redistribution strategy. It seems like the surrounding villages around Jerusalem and the surrounding rural areas were much more pleasant to live in than what the city of Jerusalem was, because after all it was a city that had been wiped out basically, and still in need of a lot of reconstruction. It would have been pretty hard to live there, and it was war torn and had been left desolate basically for 70 years. So pretty hard place to live. But surrounding villages and rural areas around Jerusalem would have been a whole lot more pleasant, and that's where everybody was living. And so what happened? They needed for a city to be rebuilt, they needed a population, and so they had this strategy of a tenth of the people who were living around Jerusalem would move into the city, and they went about that and had a strategy for doing that. And a tenth of the folk moved into Jerusalem, and it says all the people praised them. So they were doing something that was significant, and the rest of the population recognised that, and they held them in high esteem for moving into this area to become a part of Jerusalem and to be committed to the reconstruction and the redevelopment, the flourishing of Jerusalem once again. We also read in the passage that the wall is dedicated. There's a celebration that just couldn't be beat. It's for everybody, we notice. It's not just for the residents of the city, but it's for the people who are living outside of the city as well. They're invited in. And there's women, there's men, there's children, there's priests, there's Levites, there's political leaders, and there's villagers. So this is an inclusive celebration. And it involves two Thanksgiving processions who went up to the top of the wall, and one went to the left and one went to the right. And they march all the way around the wall and meet, and they're celebrating as they go on. Now, just a point in past, I don't know if you remember, but previously the opposition were making fun of the people building the wall and saying, you're building a wall that even if a fox runs on it's going to fall down. Well, here we have two very large celebration processionals, Thanksgiving processions, marching around the top of the wall. So much for a fox running on it and causing it to fall down. This wall was big, it was strong, it was wide, and it enabled these processionals to march around. And as they did that, they had all these trumpets and cymbals and singing and rejoicing, and it says it could be heard from far away. They were really in party mode. They were celebrating like you wouldn't believe. And then we also see in these chapters that systems are restored and resourced. The systems that needed to be there for the city to flourish once again. So it needed population, and it was great to celebrate their achievement, but it needed to have some systems in place that would cause the city to be everything that God wanted it to be. And so we see specifically mentioned here that there were religious systems. They talk about the priests and the Levites and the gatekeepers. All of these people were a part of the religious system, which was very important, of course, in Jerusalem. But we also see the arts. I don't know if you'd call it a system or not, but the arts driver, the idea of music and celebration was really important to the city, and this system was put in place. And then there's also law and order. We see Nehemiah returning from Susa. He had gone back to continue to serve with in Susa in the government there. And he asked leave of absence to come back to Jerusalem and to check it out. And he noticed that they were already neglecting parts of the law that they should have been upholding and being obedient to. So he returns from Susa and he enforces the requirements of the law. And so we see law and order being established in Jerusalem, which is necessary for the city to flourish. So those are three systems that are mentioned there: the religious system, the art system, and law and order. There were other systems, I'm sure, that were being established, but those are the three that are mentioned. Well, across those three chapters, that's what we observe. Let's reflect on those three major things: population distribution, celebration, and systemic integrity. First of all, population distribution. It must have, as I said, it must have been more pleasant to live outside of Jerusalem than to live inside of Jerusalem. And so people had to be invited and persuaded to move into the city. And so the tithing of a population, 1/10, being invited to move into Jerusalem to begin the process of making it a thriving city once again. The walls have been built, but for it to be a flourishing, thriving city, they needed people to be in there and calling it their town, their locality, 24/7. It reminds me of Tim Costello. All of you know of Tim Costello here in Melbourne. When he, many years ago, when he went into pastor St Kilda Baptist, an inner city church, it was on its last legs. Very few people there. And he left one of the eastern suburbs churches, Baptist churches, to move into St Kilda and to take on pastoring the community and pastoring the church as a local church in the community. Did some fantastic work there. And St Kilda Baptist, as it is today, continues to thrive on that legacy. But one of the things that Tim did was he challenged some of the eastern churches to tithe their people, to move into St Kilda and to become a part of the church. That was the idea. And some took that up, and that was the idea behind what was happening in Jerusalem. I also remember in the city of Melbourne that in the mid-90s they developed a 10-year strategy for making Melbourne a livable city. And one of the major strategies was to get more residents living in the CBD. And to bring that about, they made planning changes and did various other things that made it a whole lot more attractive for residents to move into the city, and it worked tremendously. So that 10 years later, it became known as the world's most livable city. Cities need people in them. Cities need to be vibrant. Cities need people who are committed to the flourishing and the well-being of that city. Yarra Junction needs people who are committed. The whole Yarra Valley, the Yarra Ranges, the Shire of Yarra Ranges need us to be living here and working here and putting ourselves in as much as we possibly can for the flourishing of the city. It needs people who are here, not just people who move in from outside, but people who are actually here, giving themselves for the flourishing, for the benefit, for the common good of the locality in which we live. And that was the idea here behind inviting people to live in Jerusalem. What about celebration? We see a lot of it here in these three chapters. It's great to celebrate when we have accomplished what God has set on our hearts, to celebrate the work of God. But just a couple of pointers. Such celebration needs to be inclusive. Sometimes celebration is pretty exclusive. It excludes various types of people. Excluded children might be excluded from it, or poor people, vulnerable people, people who can't dress the right way to be able to come to a celebration, all that sort of stuff. And this celebration in Jerusalem was inclusive. It included everybody. And that's what our celebration should be. Nobody should miss out. And I'm reminded of a book many years ago written by Tony Campolo called The Kingdom of God as a Party. And he went through all of the Old Testament passages especially that talked about festivals and celebration and bringing your tithe in so that the party can be really good. Kingdom of God is a party. It's a time for celebration because we are God's people and we are people of love and of peace who have that to offer to others. And let's celebrate the fact that God is a God of grace. And that God, as a God of grace, has invited us to share in all that He is. And that's time for celebration. It's a wonderful thing. The third point was systemic integrity. Systems need to be established that will encourage the flourishing of the city for the common good, for the values of the kingdom. And when I'm talking about values of the kingdom, I'm talking about fruit of the Spirit, for instance, for love and joy and peace and goodness, kindness, and self-control. Those are the values of the kingdom. Or we could read the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, or we could look at Matthew 25 where Jesus says, you've got to look after the vulnerable amongst you because as you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me. All of that is the values of the kingdom. Love one another as I have loved you. Love your neighbour. Love enemies. That's all the values of the kingdom. And we need systems in our cities that will uphold those values, that will uphold what is right for everybody within the city, for the common good. The three systems that were mentioned there, religious, they're instructive, isn't it, to have these systems of religion and the arts and law and order given to us as examples. For religion, well, the church in the locality needs to be a force for good, needs to be a force for the common good. People need to be able to look at us and see a community of love that is ready to pour ourselves out for the benefit of others, for the benefit of the locality in which we're situated. The arts? Well, God is the greatest artist of them all. He's the original and He's the best. He loves the arts and they are essential to the flourishing of a city. My prayer is that for us as a local church, that we'll be committed to backing the arts and practicing the arts and celebrating the arts in our neighbourhood. There's a lot there to be thought around, I reckon. And then law and order. God is a God of law and order. This is essential to the flourishing of the city. Not legalism. I'm not talking about legalism or even moralism. I'm talking about justice. Law and order that promotes justice and that does everything it possibly can to see that justice is served. The system must make sure that the vulnerable amongst us are treated with justice and with kindness, rather than getting bigger and better at their expense. Justice is so important as far as law and order is concerned. So you can see that the three major points in chapters 10 to 13 of Nehemiah are three major points for us as we consider our role, our place as a church in Yarra Junction. As we always do, let's have a quick look at Jesus. What about Jesus? Were these things important to Jesus? Do we see this in the Gospels? Well, Jesus wept over Jerusalem when He looked at it and He saw how far it had fallen from what God desires of a city. He longed for it and He wept. Jesus said that He didn't come to abolish the law but to fulfill it. He knew that law and order is necessary for the flourishing of the city, for the proper functioning of the city, and for the vulnerable to be protected. So He didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And Jesus sure knew how to celebrate. He goes to a wedding and the wine runs out and He produces more. Celebration. He's often seen with eating and drinking with His disciples, at dinner parties and so forth, and He's criticised, how come you disciples aren't fasting like John's disciples were fasting? And He says, well, while I'm amongst them, they're going to celebrate. It's going to be a time of celebration. There'll be time for grieving, but now is a time for celebration. Jesus enjoyed the parties. And we also see in many of his stories that celebration was a part of what he talked about. You know, the lost is found. Let's celebrate. Let's throw a party. It's all the way through there. Jesus knew how to celebrate. So it boils down to application. What does that mean for us today? The population distribution? Well, this is a big one, isn't it? You know, I'm a firm believer in the local church. And a local church wants to welcome people from anywhere and everywhere. But a local church needs to have a strong contingent of people who are in the area. I wish I lived much closer. It's not possible because of family situation and so forth, but I'm really keen and glad that I'm a part of the broader region of the Yarra Ranges. We need to be encouraging people if they're going to move, for instance, or if they're going to change jobs, to take into consideration of getting it around the Yarra Valley, of moving into this beautiful part of the world and having a job here in ways that we can work for the common good of the people around us. It's not going to be so for everybody. It was 1/10 of the people in Nehemiah's day, but it needs to be on the agenda. If we're considering moving, considering changing jobs, it needs to be on the agenda. Is God giving me an opportunity in the Yarra Valley to be more involved? That's for the sake of being salt and light in the area, to actually be here and live life 24/7. Celebration? Well, I reckon at Zach's place we know how to celebrate. But my prayer is that our gatherings will always be times of celebration, using the arts and using all that we have, all that we've been gifted with, to celebrate the life that we have. And in our mission, in our outreach, that it be a mission of celebration, being so glad that what God has done for us, so glad that we have Jesus alongside of us, so glad that we can be his followers. Celebration. And systemic integrity? Well, the question is, what are the systems we need to have in place for God's will to flourish in the Yarra Valley? This is where it's a bit frustrating, because now would be a great time if we were together in a room to split up into small groups or have a conversation, have a discussion around this question. What are the systems that we need, and how can we influence the systems that are around us? How can we encourage them to be systems for the common good, to be systems of justice, systems that look after the vulnerable amongst us? We could have a really good discussion. Maybe you'd like to, if you're watching this with somebody else, maybe that could be one of the things that you could say when you turn off this, and I'm finishing in just a moment, when you turn it off, maybe have a bit of a talk about, what are the systems that we need for Yarra Valley, for the Yarra Valley, or for wherever I live, to be flourishing, to really get their act together. And how can we encourage this? What can we do about it? It's really encouraging to me. We've just had local elections here in Victoria, and the number of Christians that have put up their hand to be candidates to get onto local councils, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I speak as somebody who has served for a few years on a local council in the city of Melbourne, and it was fantastic. It was an amazing time. And to be able to influence for the common good, the way that a locality is going, is a great thing. It might be something you want to consider for next time around in 4 years' time, to consider putting your hand up for candidature in local council. But there are a whole lot of things that we can do. What are the systems that we need to help our locality, our neighbourhood flourish? And then how can we encourage those systems to be that way? Well, Nehemiah's just been a fantastic book, and it's so relevant. All the things that we see through this man, and the calling that he had, and the work that he did, and God's work had been completed, and there was so much opposition. He completed his task, and he was a great leader, but he had great teams around him and people who were really committed to doing what God was calling him to do. Great picture of the church. Great picture of of Zach's place in all that we are and all that we're called to do. May God bless you. Thanks for listening.